By the fall of my final year of theological school, I completed the requirements that enabled me to enter the search process to find a congregation to serve. My wife Susan and I did not yet have children, and we were not bound to any particular region of the country, so I was able to cast a wide net, hoping to find the best match. Knowing the names and locations of the congregations that were looking for ministers to begin the next year, Susan and I kept a list of the realistic possibilities on our refrigerator in our Chicago apartment. I'm thinking the original list numbered over a dozen congregations. Des Moines was an intriguing congregation on that original list, as Susan grew up in Ames, and we had visited Central Iowa often as a couple. But who knew if the match would be there? My first visit to the church took place very early in the search process, before the search committee and I had even exchanged packets. Susan and I were in Ames for a visit, and we drove down to Des Moines with her parents on a Sunday afternoon for an errand. Her dad drove us by the church. It looked like no one was here, but I did get out of the car to see if the door was open so I could take a look around. I pulled on the big old wooden door that used to serve as our entrance, and sure enough, it popped open. Immediately, the alarm went off. I've been waiting 16 years to tell this story. So now I had a dilemma. Should I stick around to explain why I, a minister in search, had broken into the church? Or should I just hightail it out of there? Well, I stalled, figuring I had at least a minute or two before anyone showed up, and I wanted to see the place. So I walked into what I assume must be the worship space. It did seem like an omen for me, a former actor, that the pulpit was on a stage in a room called the auditorium. I walked onto this stage, imagining what it would be like to preach from this pulpit. And then I feared I was overstaying my welcome. And I quickly returned to the car before the cops arrived. I'm pretty sure that member Terry Swanson was the one who had to show up to make sure the church hadn't been robbed that afternoon. Sorry for that, Terry. Not that sorry. Over the next few weeks, as I learned more about the congregations on the list, I scratched some off. There were search committees who didn't want to talk to me, believing that I was too inexperienced to be considered. And I lost interest in some others as I read more about the kind of minister they were seeking and could see that it wasn't me. Eventually, the list was culled down to 4 congregations whose search committees were willing to have me share a weekend-long interview with them. So that winter, I made weekend visits to the central coast of California, the Pacific Northwest, the suburbs of Detroit, and of course to Des Moines. I really liked some of the search committees and congregations I got to visit, and some of their locations were stunningly beautiful. Still, Des Moines was rising to the top of my list. The congregation had been enjoying a vibrant 2-year interim ministry with the Reverend Annie Holmes, a time when members had been encouraged to dream and to make decisions about who they wanted to be in the years to come. A time not unlike the 2-year period that will begin for this congregation in August. There was great excitement among those in the congregation who dreamed of a church that could move beyond a 30-year membership plateau of between 200 and 250 members, and who were willing to do what they could to make that dream of growth a reality. When I learned that the leaders of this congregation shared my passion for growth, I was intrigued and I was inspired. I, too, thought it was a shame that Unitarian Universalism wasn't better known, that there weren't more people in our congregations. As I've told you many times over the years, a large part of my calling to be a minister was to help grow this religion. I remember telling one of my mentors after a preliminary interview with the search committee here, Des Moines wants to grow to 500 members by the year 2005. That's double their current size in 5 years. Isn't that great? She sighed and verbally patted me on the head. That will never happen, she said. She wasn't trying to dampen my enthusiasm. She wanted to protect me from expectations that weren't realistic. She'd been a UU long enough to know that kind of growth that fast just is not what most UU congregations can do. But I wasn't deterred. I believed in the leaders of this congregation that I had met. I believed in Unitarian Universalism. I believed in myself. When the co-chair of the search committee, David Racy, called me to tell me that they wanted me to consider this congregation my church and that they hoped I would accept the offer to be a candidate here, I was thrilled. In late April, I spent a week with this church, preaching on 2 consecutive Sundays and getting to know as many of the members and committees as possible. My second sermon, preached just before the congregation voted to call me, was entitled, "So Much is in Bud." In that sermon, I spoke of the diligent work of the congregation over the past 2 years of interim ministry, how impressed I was with how intentional they had been to examine themselves and to move beyond the challenges of the past and toward the future. I spoke of my enthusiasm for the growth goals and how, as Denise Levertov wrote in her poem Beginners, we have only begun to know the power that is in us if we would join our solitudes in the communion of struggle. For so much is unfolding that must complete its gesture, I said. So much is in bud. And it was. In July, with most of our stuff in a moving truck, Susan and I made the drive from Chicago in our 2 old Toyotas, each of us driving with a whiny cat in the passenger seat. As we took the ramp to 235 just off I-80, the evening we arrived to make Des Moines our home, a fireworks display appeared just beyond the city skyline. Good things were to come. I began at the church in August, sharing my first sermon as the settled minister in Channing Hall, where summer services were held then, as the auditorium did not yet have air conditioning and wouldn't for several more years. There'd also been a tradition at that time that the first sermon delivered after the minister's summer break was called Breakfast with the Minister. We would fill the room with the old tables the church used to own, tables that in a few cases weighed more than a Volkswagen. And we would share a potluck breakfast followed by an abbreviated service. If there had been a recent rainstorm, there would also be buckets strategically placed throughout the church to catch the drips from our leaky roof. There was usually room at this service for everyone who wanted to attend, as many were still used to taking the summer off from church. You know who you are. In this, my first sermon as the minister here, entitled Starting with the Ending, I spoke of how the health and the happiness of the future we would share as a minister and a congregation would depend on our willingness to serve together with honesty and with compassion, all the while acknowledging that our relationship was inevitably temporary. I rediscovered that first sermon just a few weeks ago, and I'm going to share portions of it with you this morning, both for nostalgia's sake and because it seems so right for this moment as this congregation transitions over the next few months and years to new ministerial leadership, with so much for this congregation still in bud. I began the sermon with a story I'd heard at a folk concert about how we live our lives backwards, how we do this whole lifespan thing all wrong. It's kind of a thought experiment, really. The musician said, "Wouldn't it be better if we could die first and then get it out of the way?" Bear with me. If we did die first, then we could really enjoy our retirements. We would have time to relax and travel and read and figure out some hobbies we want to do. Really get a good life going. Then after a while, we might want to go to work, so we're given a gold watch and an office with a view, and we make a bunch of money. But then we decide maybe money's not everything, so we change jobs, and we wind up changing jobs some more until we find ourselves doing more service kind of stuff, like working in a summer camp. But then we give up on work altogether. We think we just want to learn, so we go to college. We take enough drugs until we're ready for high school. But then we're looking at simpler things until, with Zen-like simplicity, we're just looking at language itself. And then we're past language. We're past all the talking. We're just listening and being and feeling. We're completely alive. And then we decide this whole incarnation thing is just too much of a burden, so we go out as a glimmer in someone's eye. Awesome. Living life the other way around, starting at the ending. At first, it kind of seems silly, but there's something more there, I think. Think about the relationships that you've had. You know, particularly those love relationships that started out with such great expectations, so much so that you ended up simply not getting along. All those hopes of the early days of the relationship shattered, and the broken pieces that remained became painful reminders of what could have been. When relationships like these reach their end, there is something that can happen. A new clarity, maybe even a new friendship emerges. A new capability for communication that develops as you realize that despite your differences, you have similar needs. You're just two people, both in search of love and understanding. Two people with hopes and dreams. Suddenly you can talk about things you've had to tiptoe around in the past. You can be present, honest, realistic. And then if you're lucky enough to reach this place of understanding with your former partner, you may ask yourself, why couldn't we talk like this before? What would have happened if we could have started this relationship, this realistic one? After all, it's the relationship that's meant to last. At these moments, starting with the ending starts to look pretty good. In fact, it could be the perspective that's best suited for other kinds of relationships. Think of how starting with the ending could apply to the unique relationship that exists between a minister and a congregation, a relationship that some have referred to as a marriage of sorts. Like a married couple, we covenant together to stick with each other through thick and thin, to base our dealings in trust and mutual respect, to do our best to be present to our respective needs. Perhaps this is why I've often heard the first few months of a new ministry referred to as the honeymoon. The honeymoon is a time when the minister and the congregation do their best to make a good impression, to put the other's needs ahead of their own, to enjoy those giddy bursts of emotion and expectation that are similar to those we may experience when we find ourselves in the middle of a new love relationship. For those of us who have experienced long-term relationships, though, we know that the early projections we place on our partners are often based more on our own needs than what our partners actually offer us. Much like the promises made at wedding ceremonies, sometimes the commitments of churches and ministers become complicated by unrealistic expectations and by assumptions based more on the needs of the individual players than on the needs of the greater relationship. Along these lines, author Jane Smiley cautions those who would hold on to their idealized expectations of marriage, and I contend of new ministries. She writes, "You know what getting married is? It's agreeing to take this person who right now is at the top of his form, full of hopes and ideas, feeling good, looking good, wildly interested in you because you feel the same way, and then sticking by him while he slowly disintegrates." And he does the same for you. You're his responsibility now, and he's yours. If no one else will take care of him, you will. If everyone else rejects you, he won't. He's yours, and you're his. He doesn't beat you or abuse you, hopefully, and you've made about the same bargain. Now that you know what it's like to be married, now that all the gold leaf has sort of worn off, you can make something of it. You can really learn to love each other. Much like the first few months of a marriage, the honeymoon days of a new ministry are the days in which ministers and congregations may be overly focused on idealized visions of what their relationship should be, letting that guide their interactions in ways that serve to cloud the reality of what they really have to offer. Choosing to start with the ending, then, is a way the relationship could be based in a more realistic context. In that sermon, I then spoke of how the previous weekend, the church board, the committee on ministry, and the staff were led by a regional staff person in a covenanting retreat, where we were asked to reflect upon the history of this church, particularly the ministers who had previously served here. We were invited to recount the strengths and gifts of each of these ministries and to consider how these pieces fit together to form the narrative of the First Unitarian Church of Des Moines. As members shared their perceptions of the past few decades that morning, they seemed to recount the past without the emotional ties that often burden present relationships. There wasn't always agreement about how the various ministries of the past were perceived, but there seemed to be a common recognition that each ministry was the product of a relationship that depended upon both the minister and the congregation being honest and open about expectations, disappointments, and triumphs. By sharing the perceived dynamics of the previous ministries, the congregation and I were invited to take a step back to view the overall relationship between church and minister from a more holistic perspective. Essentially, we were asked to start at the ending, not only the endings left from the ministers of those who had previously served here, but the ending that we knew would one day come when the relationship I formally began earlier that month would reach its end. These many years later, I know that by keeping our ending in mind from the start, I have been free to serve with confidence and integrity, recognizing that the time of our relationship would be, by necessity, finite, prevented me from seeing this church as an extension of myself, and respecting the inherent limits of our relationship directed me toward decisions that were always meant to serve the future as well as the present. Our longtime members have had practice with this starting with the ending dynamic. It's foundational to good interim ministry. Reverend Annie Holmes began her relationship with this congregation 2 years before I arrived, with the clear understanding that she was bridging the gap until the next settled minister was called. This interim position enabled her to be honest, to call things as she saw them, even when it wasn't pleasant, to help this congregation give voice to its past and help it focus on the possibilities of the future. I told the congregation back then, in a foreshadowing of what I suspect the next called minister will say to you, too, isn't this the kind of relationship you'd like for me to have with you, too? I believe we would all be best served by reminding ourselves that my work here also falls under the heading of interim ministry. Even if I'm here for 30 years, I made it about halfway. My time with you will inevitably come to an end. Why not keep that ending in mind as we work together so that we can be sure that the investments of time, energy, and money that we make to this church are always tempered by the realization that our individual participation does not just serve this community as we know it, but enables the future participation of those we have yet to meet, those who will find here, like many of us have, a home for their questions, a common ground for creative interchange, spiritual growth, learning, and justice-making. Taking a step further to start with the ending may be a great way to approach more than just our relationship as minister and church. It feels like a great approach to life itself. If death really is an end point, and it's difficult to know otherwise, then we have some responsibility for the lives that we lead today. If the time we have together truly is finite, then what we say to each other and do together matter a great deal. The best answers to the questions of our existence can only be approached, I think, by how we live today. And how we live today is always impacted by the reality that we may not be here tomorrow. This is our one precious life. Recognizing that it will end might be the best motivator for us to savor what we have, when we have it, and to work toward a better tomorrow for those who will follow us. I close my sermon by saying, This is the beginning of a new chapter in the history of First Unitarian Church and in the history of Mark Stringer. In the days, months, and years ahead, we will do well to remember that our work together will be impacted more by our actions than by our hopes, more by our honesty and our communication than by our unshared dreams and our secret expectations, more by the recognition of our inevitable ending than by the celebration of our present beginning. So here's to my final Sunday with you, I said, whenever that may be, somewhere down the road. I'm already looking forward to the party. And so I'll close today in a similar way, for as it turns out, after nearly 16 years, the ending has arrived and the party is next week. In the days, months, and years ahead, may this congregation keep in mind, just as you did with me, that the ministry you share with each other and with Aaron and with the ministers to come will be impacted more by your actions than by your hopes, more by your honesty and your communication than by your unshared dreams and secret expectations, more by the recognition of your inevitable endings than by the celebration of your beginnings. May it be so. Amen.